My name is Nora Bellamy. I'm 34 years old, and at 7:13 on a Thursday night, while buttercream turned sweet in the warm air and the walk-in cooler hummed behind the wall of our family bakery, my mother finally said the thing this family had been building toward for years. It was my grandfather's 78th birthday dinner, and we had folding tables pushed together in the private back room, paper plates clicking against plastic forks, relatives passing chicken salad and sheet cake, as if this were just another warm little family gathering instead of a public execution dressed like celebration. I was still wearing my apron strings loose at my waist from closing out the front case, flour dust on my black slacks, my phone in my pocket beside a flagged vendor email, and a rent reminder I had already planned to handle after everyone left. Then Cynthia Bellamy dropped the bakery keys into Paige's hand, smiled like she was gifting the room a happy ending, and said, "You're built to work, Nora, not to be chosen." She said it in front of my grandfather, my stepfather Martin, two church friends, my Aunt Denise, and the cousins who only ever show up once the display cakes are already photographed. Paige laughed first, small and shiny and pleased with herself, her nails wrapped around the keyring like she had already inherited more than she understood. That line should have humiliated me into tears. Instead, it clarified everything. I didn't remind my mother who opened before dawn, who covered payroll gaps, who answered dairy calls, who kept the ovens running through two dead Januaries and one near collapsed summer by moving my own savings where her promises had failed. I didn't ask Paige if she knew what our flour terms were, what the landlord's cure date had been 18 months ago, or whose name was actually holding the bakery together on paper. I just stood there with sugar, vanilla, and compressor heat thick in the back of my throat and understood all at once that none of this was sudden. Paige got introduced. I got deployed. Paige got praised. I got called when something expensive was breaking. In this family, I was good enough to save the bakery, just never good enough to be seen as its future. So I took off my apron, folded it over the back of a metal chair, and left them their little coronation before they could ask me to smile for it. 3 days later, the supplier rep and the landlord called because Paige's New Era posts had reached the accounts, but the lease, the equipment loans, and the trademark renewal still ended in my name. Before I tell you what froze first and why my mother suddenly needed me to be happy for my sister, tell me what time it is where you are and where you're watching from. I always want to know how far a story like this travels before it lands on someone who already knows what it feels like to build the business and still gets seated outside the blessing. Here's what they didn't understand when my mother dropped those keys into Paige's hand like she was handing over legacy instead of staging another theft in better lighting. They thought they were doing what they had always done: give the visible daughter the title, push the practical daughter back into function, and trust that I would keep the machinery under the floor running because I always had. What they were actually doing was launching a transfer story on top of a bakery structure they did not control. I manage bakery operations and bookkeeping, which means I do not hear the phrase fresh start the way my mother does. I hear rent exposure, vendor terms, payroll drag, food cost volatility, equipment debt, trademark risk, and the exact point where sentiment starts pretending it can outrun accounts payable. 4 years earlier, when the bakery should have folded for good, I did the work nobody else in that family wanted photographed. I covered arrears with my own savings. I negotiated new flour and dairy terms after my mother had burned through too much goodwill and too many promises. I stabilized payroll twice in one winter and once again during a dead August when the front case looked pretty and the account balances looked sick. I signed on to the equipment loans because the bank would not keep pretending Cynthia's optimism was collateral. I became the named tenant on the lease renewal because the landlord had finally stopped trusting charm without a second signature attached. And when the bakery name itself was close to slipping because the prior renewal had been mishandled, I filed the trademark renewal personally and kept the record current under my authority. None of that made good social media. Paige still got to float in with rebrand ideas, pastel boxes, seasonal slogans, and the kind of clean hands people mistake for vision. I got the 4:12 a.m. starts, the spreadsheet nights, the stale coffee, the vendor calls, and the special humiliation of being treated like hired help inside a business that would have died without me at least 3 separate times. By the next morning after my grandfather's birthday dinner, I was at my kitchen table in Lexington with cold coffee beside my laptop, pulling the whole chain one document at a time because I already knew that Thursday had not ended at humiliation. It had moved into exposure. Lease renewal first. My name still sitting in the active tenant line. Then the equipment loan agreements, both of them still showing me as the live co-signer attached to restructuring compliance. Then the trademark renewal confirmation. Then the bank transfers from the slow seasons. Then the past due rent notices from the period my mother now refers to as that little rough patch, as if the bakery had not nearly been taken back by math. After that, I opened the archived texts from Cynthia, which read like a confession once you stripped the family softness off them. Please keep the bakery alive quietly. Don't scare your grandfather with numbers. Your sister is trying to bring beauty back into this place. After everything we've sacrificed, don't make paperwork into a punishment. There it was again, their pattern in one neat stack. Paige got beauty. I got burden. She got the front. I got the file. Around 9:26 Monday morning, I made the first professional move. I did not call my mother and ask whether she had already told customers, church friends, or wedding clients that Paige was the new owner in any legal sense. I did not send Paige a sisterly message about gratitude or the difference between being handed keys and being handed control. I confirmed the lease status, checked the loan portals, and emailed our main supplier rep instructing him to route any inquiry tied to new purchasing authority or account realignment through me in writing. Then I sent a brief note to the landlord's office stating that no tenancy transfer, subassignment, or operator substitution had been executed, and any statement suggesting otherwise should be treated as premature. No drama, no threat, just the end of assumption. The consequences arrived faster than I expected. By Monday afternoon, the dairy rep asked whether upcoming order volume tied to Paige's relaunch posts was actually authorized under the current account. By Tuesday morning, the landlord's office wanted to know why a new era storefront relaunch was being advertised if the lease still rested on my active authority. Then Tuesday night, Paige posted a carousel calling herself the next owner of Bellamy Bakery, all soft lighting and sugared croissants, and one caption about carrying the family dream forward. That was the first clue this wasn't just about one ugly line at dinner or one key dropped for effect. My mother had already sold a legal handoff story to the outside world on top of lease rights, supplier standing, loan obligations, and a trademark chain she assumed I would never force into daylight. Funny how often families call a woman supportive when what they really mean is too disciplined to interrupt the lie. The first panic call came 3 days after my grandfather's birthday dinner at 8:41 a.m. While I was in my office above the prep kitchen reconciling a weekly ingredient variance report that should have been boring and would have been if my family had not once again decided to build a public fantasy on top of paper they did not control. I had one screen on butter and flour ratios, one on labor percentages, and one on the Bellamy Bakery file I had been very carefully refusing to call a crisis until somebody outside the family used language sharp enough to earn the word. The call came from Greg Harmon, our main supplier rep, and the second I heard his voice, I knew Paige's little new era performance had already reached the wrong desks. "Nora," he said, too careful to be casual, "I need to know whether I'm extending launch cycle product volume under your authority or whether your sister is out there talking like she owns an account she can't actually bind. I've got a dairy increase request, premium chocolate hold, and a flour adjustment that usually only happen if the operator is stable." There it was. Not because my mother had suddenly regretted the keys, not because anyone in that back room had gone home feeling ashamed that the daughter who kept the bakery alive had just been told she was built to work instead of chosen. Because the supplier chain had finally reached the point where family theater stops counting as authority. I told Greg to send every request in writing and hold any expansion tied to a change in operator until I clarified account responsibility. Then I hung up and wrote the line that mattered most in my notes. Relaunch story moving faster than account authority. At 8:53, his email hit my inbox. Product expansion, operator confirmation, credit exposure concern, one file, one family lie, one more day where I was being asked to make fantasy look solvent. At 9:07, the landlord's office called, not the property manager's assistant this time. The landlord himself, Richard Mays, who only ever picks up the phone when charm has already failed him. Nora, he said, I'm looking at social posts announcing a new owner and a storefront rebrand, but the lease renewal sitting in my drawer still has your name on the line and no assignment request in sight. Tell me I'm not about to get dragged into family improvisation. That sentence almost made me laugh, not because anything was funny, but because it was the cleanest description of my mother I had heard in years. Family improvisation. That was the whole Bellamy way. Promise first, document later, and rely on me to take the shame out of the gap between them. I told Richard exactly what I told Greg. No transfer had been approved, no lease substitution had been executed. No one should rely on any statement suggesting otherwise. At 9:19, Paige texted for the first time since the birthday dinner. Why is everyone suddenly acting weird about the bakery? At 9:24, my mother called. At 9:29, she called again. At 9:36, Martin left a voicemail in that weary, masculine tone men use when they want coercion to sound like family leadership. Don't make this ugly, he said. Your sister needs this. There it was again. Their announcement, my ugliness, their dependence on my signature, my failure to be supportive, their lie, my timing. I still did not answer because discipline is one of the only pleasures left when your family is certain you will eventually reorganize your whole nervous system around their panic. At 9:42, the family group chat came back to life after a weekend of Paige's pastel mock-ups, congratulatory church comments, and Cynthia's heart emojis under every post. Mom wrote, Nora answer Greg. Paige followed with, This is literally just paperwork. Martin added, Don't punish your sister for one happy moment. There it was, the inversion I had grown up inside. Their public overreach became my punishment. Their reckless assumption became my bitterness. Their fresh start became my duty to make it real. I let the thread sit and went back to the variance report long enough to finish the cream cheese calculation because I wanted one more ordinary business thing done before I stepped fully into the family emergency they had manufactured. At 10:03, the next official call came, and this one changed the shape of the day. It was from a restructuring officer at the equipment lender, a woman named Kara Bishop, whose job existed solely to care about risk, no matter how pretty the cupcakes looked in the front case. Her tone was professional, but underneath it was the kind of irritation that means someone has already spoken too confidently in a room where money was listening. Ms. Bellamy, she said. We're seeing public branding suggesting a management transfer, while two active equipment notes remain tied to your guarantor profile and reporting chain. If operational control is changing, we require review before the bakery presents itself as a new operator. Not because they suddenly found a conscience, not because they missed me, because something had already started falling apart in institutional language. Loan exposure, lease authority, supplier risk. One family story, three separate systems quietly refusing to accept it. At 10:21, my mother left the voicemail I had been expecting since Friday. She did not sound soft. She sounded inconvenienced that the daughter she had publicly reduced was still sitting inside the machine. Nora, call me back and fix this quietly. Paige has people coming Saturday. Wedding clients are already asking questions, and you do not get to sabotage your sister because you're too stubborn to celebrate her. I saved it twice. Fix this quietly. There it was again. Not, I'm sorry. Not, can we talk? Not even a decent lie ambitious enough to call itself misunderstanding. Just the command. Convert public disrespect back into private labor, not because they cared, because the file still did. At 10:34, Paige called, and I answered because I wanted her panic in her own voice before my mother rewrote it into something sweeter. She did not say hello. Why are you doing this? She asked. Mom says you're trying to make me look fake. I looked at the lease, the loans, the trademark confirmation, and the 4 years of transfers that had kept her little branding ideas from collapsing into bankruptcy. You posted owner before you had authority, I said. That's not me making you look fake. She inhaled sharply. So you're really going to freeze the whole bakery over this? No, I said. I'm refusing to fake a transfer because you wanted the photo first. Then I ended the call. By 10:49, Kara sent a formal follow-up. Greg did too. Richard's office copied counsel. The tone had changed from clarification to containment. If I have one strength my family never learned how to fear early enough, it is that I know exactly when a situation stops being emotional and starts becoming procedural. I sent one sentence to Cynthia, Paige, and Martin after that, and only because I wanted the words somewhere they could not smother later. No transfer has been approved. Then I turned my phone face down and went back to the variance report because if I was going to be accused of ruining the bakery, I was at least going to do it after finishing the work that still kept it honest. What would you do when the same people who told you to be happy for your sister only started panicking once the supplier, the landlord, and the lender all learned your name was still the one holding the bakery together? The next morning, the problem changed categories. Up to that point, my mother still thought this was about whether I was being generous enough. Paige still thought this was about whether I was bitter enough to interrupt her spotlight. And Martin clearly believed the right mix of annoyance and family language could flatten the whole thing into one more administrative storm I would absorb before Saturday. But at 8:06 a.m. on Wednesday, Kara Bishop forwarded the lender review note, and Richard Mays sent the lease clarification request, and the wording on those 2 pages made my whole body go cold in a way the birthday dinner had not. The issue was no longer a family handoff with a paperwork lag. It was now an operator mismatch affecting leased premises, active equipment debt, vendor release exposure, and trademark-linked commercial identity. In plain English, that meant my mother had not just humiliated me in front of my grandfather and handed Paige a key for effect. She had already let customers, suppliers, lenders, and the landlord rely on a version of reality where my authority either did not matter or could be assumed after the fact. That was when the story stopped being about my feelings and became about liability, name misuse, and a business chain they were trying to wear like a costume. I called Kara first and asked the one question that mattered. Has anyone represented directly or indirectly that I already agreed to transfer operational control and that the remaining issue is just administrative timing? She paused just long enough to answer the question before she answered it. Your mother described the transition as a family succession already settled in. Principal, she said. From our side, the problem is that the documents do not say what the public messaging says. Settled in principle. There it was. The Bellamy family religion translated into finance language. My work was assumed. My signature was a courtesy. My risk was somehow maternal property the second Paige wanted a prettier life. I thanked Kara, hung up, and opened a new folder on my desktop labeled exactly what the situation had become. Bellamy Bakery, unauthorized transfer assumption, full record. Then I built the path the way I would build any case file that needed to survive tone, denial, and selective memory. Lease renewal first, with my name still fixed in the active tenant line after the last missed rent cycle nearly cost us the storefront. Then the 2 equipment loan agreements showing my co-signer liability and reporting chain. Then the trademark renewal confirmation that had kept the bakery name from slipping into lapse, while my mother called it one of those online form things. Then the emergency transfers from my own savings that had covered payroll, flour, and utility gaps during the worst slow seasons. Then the vendor credit emails from the months when Greg nearly cut us off because Cynthia had started treating 30-day terms like personal optimism. After that came the past due rent notices, the cure warning, and the messages from my mother that looked almost indecent once I read them without family softness layered over them. Keep the bakery alive quietly. Do not scare your grandfather with numbers. Your sister is the one people connect to. After everything we've sacrificed, don't punish us with paperwork. Punish. That word sat there like a little shrine to the whole family structure. Paige got to be connected to the brand. I got connected to the debt. Around 10:14, Greg sent me screenshots of Paige's relaunch posts, the ones calling herself the next owner carrying the bakery into its new chapter, and matched them with pending order requests for premium butter, couverture chocolate, custom cake boards, and increased dairy volume. I pulled those into the file next and cross-checked the timestamps against Kara's lender note, Richard's lease concern, and the supplier hold warnings. Facts get louder when they line up by minute instead of mood. At 10:39, Richard called back and gave me the official contact bridge I needed. Nora, I need you to tell me plainly whether I should treat Saturday's relaunch as a tenant-led event under your authority or as a problem, he said. because if your sister is presenting herself as owner while the lease still runs through you, that becomes my problem fast. There it was again. Not family, not emotion, commercial reality. I told him no assignment, no substitution, no approved operator change existed. He thanked me in the flat voice landlords use when somebody else's family has just tried to make them participate in fiction. Then my mother called from the bakery line, which meant she was done trying to sound hurt and ready to sound managerial. I answered because by then I wanted her plain voice, not her mother voice. "This has gone far enough," she said. "No hello, no Nora. The lender is nervous, Richard is overreacting, and Greg is threatening to embarrass your sister in front of clients. Fix it. Fix it. No apology for the dinner, no acknowledgement of the years, no gratitude for the fact that there was still a bakery to fight over at all. Just the old command." I asked, "Did you tell them I had already agreed?" Silence. Then, "I told them the family had this handled." I wrote that down too, because it was not just dishonest, it was revealing. My mother had never believed my authority was real authority. She believed it was backroom labor that should dissolve the second the chosen daughter needed a front-facing future. I thought about being 27 and sleeping on a flour sack in the office during a freezer failure while Paige posted behind-the-scenes stories calling the bakery our little dream. I thought about being 30 and wiring money to cover payroll while my mother told me not to mention amounts because Paige was too creative for that kind of pressure. I thought about being 33 and standing with Richard in the empty front room after close, signing the lease renewal in my own name while Cynthia cried about legacy and Martin said, "You're the one built for the heavy part." Every time I saved the shop, they called it family. Every time I protected myself, they called it cold. "No," I told my mother, "what you want is not a handoff, it's retroactive permission." She went sharp immediately. "After everything we've sacrificed, you owe your sister this chance." Oh, there it was again. Not partnership, not trust. Debt. The debt I was apparently supposed to keep paying because I knew how to stop a bakery from dying while prettier people smiled near the pastry case. "What I owe," I said, "is accuracy to every document carrying my name." Then I ended the call and sent one written instruction to Kara, Greg, Richard, and counsel, confirming that no transfer of operational control, lease authority, loan responsibility, supplier access, or trademark use authorization had been executed, and that any contrary public representation should be treated as unauthorized. No speech, no birthday replay. Just the file corrected before their story hardened any further. At 11:22, Paige texted, "Mom says you're doing this because no one ever picked you for the front." I read it once and filed it, because by then I could finally name the relationship without flinching. This was not family tension. It was extraction dressed up as succession. Not love, not sacrifice, just access with frosting on it. Paige's Saturday relaunch tasting started at 4 p.m., and I walked into the bakery at 4:19 because timing matters when people are still relaxed enough inside their own lie to keep performing it. The front cases were polished. The glass caught the late afternoon light and threw it back across rows of strawberry petit fours, lemon tarts, and miniature wedding cake samples iced in soft blush and ivory, like the whole room had been curated to suggest taste, continuity, and feminine destiny. Butter, vanilla, espresso, and warm sugar sat thick in the air. A photographer from one of the local food blogs was already crouched near the pastry case taking close shots of a croissant tower Paige had not laminated, proofed, or baked. Two wedding clients stood by the consult table with tasting cards in their hands. Greg Harmon from the supplier side was near the coffee station pretending to admire the seasonal display while watching the account chain in real time. Richard Mays, the landlord, stood near the entry with one hand in his coat pocket and the expression men wear when they know they have been dragged into family fiction and intend to remember exactly who did it. My mother was in the center of the room, of course, smiling in rose lipstick and a cream blouse, greeting people like she had personally carried the bakery through every dead winter and rent scare herself. Paige stood beside the cake display in a fitted pale blue dress with a gold name pin that read "Owner" in looping script, laughing too brightly, receiving compliments as if the title were already settled because enough strangers had said it out loud. That was the whole family system in one frame. She got the pin, I got the paper. My mother saw me first and crossed the floor fast, smile still attached but thinner now. "Nora," she said under her breath, "do not make this ugly in front of clients." There it was again, their unauthorized transfer, my ugliness, their staged certainty, my timing. "You already did that when you announced an owner before the file existed," I said. Paige turned then, still smiling for the room. "Look who finally came to support the bakery," she said, loud enough for the wedding clients and the church friends by the front window to hear. That was my ignition line handed to me for free. "Support would have been a funny word to use before you told vendors and customers a transfer had already happened," I said. The room thinned immediately. Not silence yet, just listening. One blogger lowered her camera. One wedding client stopped turning her tasting card over in her hand. Greg looked up from his phone. Richard did not move at all, which was how I knew he had already decided to stay for the whole thing. I set my folder on the consult table beside the peony sample board and opened it without hurry. Lease renewal, equipment loan agreements, trademark renewal confirmation, supplier account note, landlord clarification request. Then I turned the top page toward Greg and Richard, instead of toward my family, because professionals are usually the first honest people left in rooms like that. "Before anyone here keeps using the word owner," I said, "you should know the lease, the equipment debt, the supplier chain, and the trademark authority are all still in my name, and no transfer has been approved." Paige let out a short laugh that broke in the middle. "Oh my God, are you seriously doing this now?" "You did it first," I said. "You just did it with cookies and flowers." That line traveled. I could feel it move through the room, because everybody there understood, at least dimly, that something administrative had just become moral. My mother stepped closer and lowered her voice another notch. "Be happy for your sister." "No," I said. "Be accurate." Richard looked at the lease copy, then at me, then at Cynthia. "There has been no assignment request," he said flatly. Greg checked his phone and added, "And no authority update on the supplier account." One of the wedding clients asked, too softly at first, "So who can actually confirm future bookings?" There it was. The room had stopped belonging to the performance and started belonging to the file. "I can," I said, "and I have not authorized a new operator structure." Paige's face changed then, losing the glossy public version of itself and showing the smaller, angrier thing underneath. "You're humiliating me because you can't stand being in the back," she snapped. There was the family logic in one sentence, their years of extraction reduced to my jealousy. "No," I said. "I'm refusing to let labor be erased into branding." That was the needle line, and it cut because even my mother went still after it. Then the register terminal chirped an account hold notice. Just once, short, mechanical. Enough. Greg glanced down and inhaled through his nose. "The inventory release freeze is still active," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough for the room to hear. Richard followed with the sentence that killed the rest of the performance. "And if the named tenant is not the operating party being represented here, then this event itself is now inside a lease problem." One of the food bloggers lowered her camera completely. A church friend near the window whispered, "Linda, what is this?" In the delighted, horrified tone women use when politeness and gossip finally become the same event. Paige took one step toward me. "You would destroy the whole relaunch over paperwork?" There it was again. A lease becomes paperwork. Debt becomes paperwork. Trademark control becomes paperwork. Women like me are always expected to carry the file quietly until the moment we use it, and then suddenly it becomes just paper. "No," I said. "I'm refusing to bake your fantasy into a business." That one landed harder than the last because even Martin looked at the floor. My mother reached for the folder and I moved it away before she touched it. "Do not shame this family in front of strangers," she hissed. I looked at the wedding clients, the bloggers, Greg, Richard, the church people, the sample cakes Paige had been posing beside, and then back at her. "You use strangers as witnesses to a lie," I said. "I'm just the first person in the room willing to name it." That was the end of it, not because anyone confessed, because the room turned procedural. Greg began telling his assistant to keep the expanded order hold in place. Richard asked for a formal meeting Monday on operator status and lease authority. One wedding client quietly gathered her purse. The blogger nearest the register stopped taking beauty shots and started writing notes. I closed the folder, picked it up, and stepped back before the moment could cheapen into crying and amateur family ethics. At the door, Paige called after me, voice cracking now. "You're doing this because no one ever picked you." I turned once. "No," I said. "I'm doing this because you tried to wear what I built." Then I walked out into the Lexington evening while the relaunch kept going behind me without authority, without supply certainty, and without the daughter they had always counted on to make the ugly part disappear. When a family uses your silence as staging for a public lie, is telling the truth revenge, or just the first honest inventory anyone has done in the room? Public exposure did not make me feel healed. It did not send me home glowing with justice or standing in my kitchen reliving Paige's face with anything that resembled peace. It made me feel wired, sick, and so awake at 2:14 a.m. that I was sitting on the floor against my refrigerator with a legal pad in my lap and a glass of water I kept forgetting to drink, because some old part of my body still thought stopping the family machine was more dangerous than being fed into it. That is the part stories like this usually fake. They pretend that once the truth enters the room, your nervous system thanks you for it. Mine didn't. Mine still knew the old job: smooth the tension, save the business, translate the damage into something survivable for everybody else. By Sunday morning, the tactic shift had already started. My mother texted first, saying I had embarrassed her in front of clients, church friends, and people who did not need to see family conflict. Martin followed with the practical version, saying the landlord was now touchy, the wedding clients were asking questions, and I had turned one internal transition into a public humiliation. Paige sent 4 texts inside 2 hours. The first accused me of jealousy. The second said I had always confused control with love. The third said I would rather burn the bakery than let her shine. The fourth was the truest without meaning to be. "You could have let me have one day." There it was again. The whole Bellamy theology in one sentence. Let the visible daughter have the day. Let the practical daughter have the burden. Let me restore the lease, the loans, the suppliers, the name, and then call me cruel the second I refuse to disappear behind it. What bothered me most was not what they said. It was what some older, more conditioned part of me was still waiting for: permission. Permission to stop rescuing them. Permission to stop fronting money in sequence every time my mother confused optimism with solvency. Permission to stop calling my own usefulness loyalty. So instead of answering anyone, I did what my family has always hated most. I took the pattern somewhere honest. My therapist, Dr. Camille Warren, has an office over a dental practice that smells faintly like cedar and copier toner. And by Monday afternoon, I was sitting across from her with my coat still on, because I knew if I let myself get comfortable, I would start minimizing. I gave her the facts in order because facts are safer than grief. My grandfather's dinner, the keys, my mother's line, Greg's call, Kara's note, Richard's warning, the relaunch tasting, the register hold, my mother calling it ugly when what she meant was visible. Dr. Warren let me finish, then asked the one question that changed the category of the whole story. "When did your family first teach you that your competence was the price of being kept around?" I stared at the edge of the rug because I already knew the answer and because saying it out loud would make it harder to romanticize later. I was 13 when my mother started leaving cash count envelopes on the counter for me while Paige got taken up front to learn customer warmth. I was 25 when I used my tax refund to help cover a winter payroll gap and got thanked by being told not to mention the amount because it would make Paige feel guilty. I was 30 when I stayed up 2 nights fixing vendor aging and equipment defaults, while my mother told everyone Paige had the gift that keeps the bakery alive. Dr. Warren did not tell me to forgive them. She asked the better question. "How long have you been calling unpaid rescue love?" That one stayed in my ribs. I went home and wrote the pattern down the way I would write any operating chronology that needed to survive scrutiny. Paige gets introduced, I get assigned. Cynthia promises, I stabilize. Martin minimizes, I translate. Public softness on one side, structural labor on the other. Once it was on paper, the guilt lost some of its holiness. It started looking less like conscience and more like training. Then came the meeting. My mother texted Tuesday morning asking for one adult conversation before this gets beyond repair, which in my family has always meant let us rename the damage before the documents do it for us. I agreed only because I wanted the truth said in a room where nobody could hide behind sheet cake, candles, or customers. We met that afternoon in the bakery office after close, cooler motors humming through the wall, flour dust still caught in the seams of the tile, the stale smell of butter and sugar sitting low in the air. My mother started with revision. She said the line at dinner had been careless, not cruel. Paige said the tasting was just meant to create momentum. Martin said no one expected me to make a public issue out of what should have stayed in the family. Then I laid the documents down one by one: lease renewal, equipment loan agreements, trademark filing confirmation, vendor hold emails, emergency transfers, past due rent notices, my mother's keep the bakery alive quietly messages. The room changed the way rooms always change when paper finally outruns tone. My mother snapped first. You always need documents to feel powerful. No, I said, I need documents when the people around me keep trying to wear what I paid to keep alive. Martin called me rigid. Paige called me vindictive. Then she said the truest thing in the room by accident. You could have just signed it and let me have this. There it was. Not succession, not family, access. Clean, bright, undeniable. Something inside me went still then, not dramatic, not wounded, just finished. I am not authorizing a transfer because Mom promised you a future before she controlled it, I said. I am not reopening supplier lines so you can keep performing ownership. I am not putting my name back under this bakery to protect another public fantasy. And I am done being the daughter you remember only when the books, the lease, or the oven stop cooperating. My mother called that cruel. Martin said I was making everything final over paperwork. Paige started crying in that furious, breathless way favored people do when consequence refuses to reorganize itself around their comfort. I stood up anyway. No, I said. I'm just done being your cleanup. Then I took my file and left them in the office with the first accurate version of me they had ever been forced to hear. The fallout took a little under 6 weeks, and the reason it landed so hard was that it moved through the dull adult places first. Not through shouting, not through dramatic exits, through loan review language, vendor holds, lease authority, and the kind of written clarification that leaves no room for my mother's favorite trick, which was always to blur sequence until she came out sounding generous and I came out sounding difficult. The equipment lender put the restructuring review into active restriction status the Monday after the tasting. That meant no fresh renegotiation, no expanded purchasing leverage, and no clean new operator story until the guarantor chain and control structure matched what Paige had already posted online. Greg kept the supplier holds in place on the premium butter, dairy volume increase, and imported chocolate request, which meant the relaunch menu shrank in real time from glossy abundance into whatever could be covered by existing cash flow and false confidence. Richard Mays, who had been polite longer than most landlords would have been, sent a written demand for operator clarification and lease compliance review, because if the bakery was being presented publicly as Paige's business while the active tenant obligations still ran through me, then he was no longer dealing with family sentiment. He was dealing with risk. That was the part my mother hated most. Not that the bakery was hurting, that strangers had started asking the exact questions I had been answering alone for 4 years. One of the wedding clients quietly moved her cake consult after hearing temporary supplier issue twice in the same week. A local food blogger never posted the relaunch feature she had promised because, as Greg later told me, she had heard enough off-record caution to lose interest in becoming collateral. Paige's soft focus new era post slowed, then stopped. The owner pin disappeared. Cynthia stopped using that word too. Funny how fast ownership becomes a family misunderstanding once lenders, suppliers, and landlords start reading the same file. My mother tried every version of pressure she still had left. First, she called me bitter. Then she called me punitive. Then she went softer and meaner at the same time, which was always her strongest register. You are punishing staff now, she said in one voicemail. You are punishing your grandfather's legacy, she said in another. What she never said was the truth. She had tried to hand Paige a bakery held together by my lease authority, my credit rehabilitation, my savings, my signature, and my willingness to be invisible. The second invisibility ended, so did the fantasy that Paige's charm counted as an operating system. I did not rescue the whole bakery, but I did one narrow ethical thing because there is a difference between boundaries and collateral cruelty. Through counsel, I authorized a one-time payroll file export and final vendor aging summary so the employees who had nothing to do with my family's favoritism would not be trapped inside a mess they did not build. Nothing more. No new guarantees, no fresh supplier access, no handoff language, just one clean operational act separating workers from mythology. After that, I became unavailable in the only way that matters. Written only. Every lender question through counsel. Every vendor question through counsel. Every "can we just talk as a family" left unanswered unless it came attached to an actual document and an actual issue. About a month after the tasting, Kara Bishop's office requested a formal declaration confirming that no transfer of operational control, no substitution of guarantor authority, and no approval of Paige as successor operator had ever been executed. Richard's office requested matching confirmation that the lease remained in my name and that any public representation to the contrary had been unauthorized. I reviewed both, corrected one date and one phrase, and signed them that afternoon. No embellishment, no revenge speech, no daughterly grief hidden inside commercial language, just a clean record. That was more devastating than any scream I could have made in the bakery, because once the facts were fixed in the lender file, the vendor chain, and the lease record, my mother could no longer keep narrating me into the role of resentful sister instead of the woman who had quietly kept the bakery from dying. Facts do not need charisma. That is why they outlast almost everyone. A month later, my mother asked to meet, and I almost said no because by then I understood something I had spent most of my adult life trying not to understand. Closure is not the same thing as restored access, and access is not the same thing as love. Still, I agreed to one final meeting because I wanted the truth said in a room where nobody could soften it back into bakery weather. We met in my attorney's conference room at 4:36 on a Thursday, late light flattening against the blinds, stale coffee cooling untouched near the side credenza, and the kind of dry office air that makes every sentence sound more official than the speaker intended. Cynthia arrived first in one of her soft cream blouses, the kind she used whenever she wanted to look maternal, burdened, and morally innocent all at once. Martin came in next with the posture of a man who had spent years standing beside the wrong decisions and still hoped that counted as neutrality. Paige came last. No owner pin now, no curated relaunch glow, just a woman who had finally learned that being photographed in front of a pastry case is not the same thing as holding a business together. My mother opened exactly the way I knew she would, not with apology, with hardship. "This has been devastating for the family," she said. There it was, the old rearrangement. Blur the damage, make it sound communal, make it feel like weather so nobody has to name where it began. I let the silence sit there long enough to become useful, then I gave her the cleanest sentence I had. "You handed Paige a bakery identity built on my lease, my guarantor risk, my vendor credibility, and my trademark work, then expected me to keep it all alive after telling me I was built to work and not to be chosen." My mother cried after that, and maybe the tears were real. They usually are by the time consequence finally gets through performance. But tears are weather, not proof, and I had finally learned not to confuse visible pain with accountability. Martin tried next because men like him always step in after the first softness fails. "We were trying to give your sister a chance," he said. "That's all this ever was." I looked at him and felt nothing but accuracy. "No," I said, "that's what you told yourselves. What it actually was another plan built on the assumption that I would absorb the risk and disappear behind it." Paige spoke then, and the saddest part was that she still sounded more confused than ashamed. "I thought Mom had worked it out with you," she said. "I thought it was basically done." There it was, the whole family structure in one sentence. She gets the assurance. I get the sequence. She gets the front counter. I get the debt, the dawn shifts, the rent cures, and the part nobody wants to photograph. "That was always the luxury you were given," I told her. "Other people were assigned the seriousness for you." My mother asked the fantasy question after that. The one families like mine always ask once the useful daughter is still in the room, but no longer available on command. Is there any way to fix this? She said. That line might once have worked on me, because I used to hear vague hurt and immediately start translating it into labor. A vendor call, a lease amendment, a softer consequence, a way to keep everyone from feeling the full shape of what they did. But by then, I knew the difference between being needed and being loved, and they are not interchangeable, no matter how many mothers cry when the file stops protecting them. You can't fix this with emotion, I said. You can only deal with it through sequence. Then I told them the only path left. No invisible rescue, no family handoff story. If they wanted the bakery to keep operating without me, it would happen through formal restructuring, written release, and an attorney-reviewed separation of my name from every obligation I had carried. My mother called that cold. I called it the first honest language the bakery had heard in years. Love without respect is just labor extraction with softer wording, and I was done dressing it up for them. 3 weeks later, the separation papers were signed. My name came off the lease and the loan chain through a negotiated exit package because for the first time in their lives, my family understood what they should have understood before the birthday dinner ever started. They could not keep using me as invisible structure while pretending I was emotionally optional. Paige did not become the triumphant next-generation owner my mother had tried to announce. She became what she had always actually been, a woman handed a spotlight she mistook for infrastructure. The bakery did not collapse overnight, but the fantasy did. Greg stopped speaking to Cynthia like she ran a stable operation. Richard stopped pretending sentiment counted as tenancy discipline. My mother stopped saying new era. Even she could hear how thin it sounded once the file had spoken. I used my exit money, plus what was left of my own savings after 4 years of holding everybody else upright, to sign the lease on a smaller artisan pastry studio under my own name on the edge of downtown Lexington. One prep kitchen, one front counter, one proofing cabinet. No family mythology baked into the walls. I opened on a Thursday with a booked-out pre-order list, 2 wholesale coffee accounts, and the kind of quiet that feels earned instead of lonely. Then my attorney sent the final notice. Clean, narrow, non-negotiable. I would never again finance, guarantee, shield, restructure, or quietly operate any family business that treated me like hired help while asking me to call it love. No more invisible rescue, no more off-record fixes, no more maternal urgency used as a solvent for paperwork. I approved the letter without changing a word. That was the deeper revenge. Not that Paige lost the owner fantasy. Not that my mother had to sit with the embarrassment of a relaunch that died inside lender notes, supplier holds, and lease review language. Not even that Martin finally had to look at the cost of always treating my structure like support staff. The deeper revenge was this. I was no longer available for the role they had written for me. I was not the back room, not the hidden guarantor, not the daughter who turned panic into continuity while someone else wore the pin. They did not miss me as a daughter. They missed the function. Too many families call that love because admitting the difference would force them to look at what they built. So tell me honestly, if your family only remembered your value when the lease, the loans, or the supplier accounts were at risk, would you ever let them back in once you finally put your own name on the door? And what would have been your breaking point, the birthday dinner, the frozen accounts, the fake relaunch, or the moment you realized they never really meant family in a way that included your dignity?